And hello, everyone. This is our fourth cast on the American Revolution, and we'll be watching this one on Wednesday. Um, we left off with the rising tensions between the colonies and the British Crown. And in our notes, I just want to hit a couple of highlights real fast that we discussed but didn't really look at. What you can do is you can add the notes right here as I'm talking. And this is a picture of the Boston Massacre that we mentioned. This was where colonists were throwing rocks and snowballs and stuff at British soldiers. And for some reason, we don't really know how or why a shot was fired and several colonists were killed. This was an engraving made by Paul Revere. And this would be something you might want to put down. Like, why would Paul Revere want to emphasize the Boston Massacre? This picture spread like wildfire through the colonies. And they didn't have Twitter. And you can kind of relate that to some things that are going on in our country now with violence of authority against civilian population. You can make your own conclusions, but why would Paul Revere, he wants to rebel against England, why is he going to spread that? This is a picture here of Franklin, Jefferson, Adams, and Robert Livingston, and they're basically drafting a Declaration of Independence. This was the Second Continental Congress, which met in 1776. The first met in 1775. And so you might want to just say this is during the Second Continental Congress, where by this time the colonists have decided they're going to break away. It's just that's the sentiment of the leadership. Now they have to persuade everybody else. This final picture is actually at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and this was one of the activities that we did together in class and that you did on your own. Okay, so now let's talk about the American Revolution itself. Obviously, the war starts July 4th, 1776, and you can add that right here. The war starts with America declaring independence. And at first, the Americans, it didn't look good for them. Now, a couple of battles had been fought, and Americans had done well. Lexington and Concord were fought in 1775. It's like 16 months later that the Declaration is being signed, 15 months later. The Battle of Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill were fought in Boston. So you have military campaigns, but it's an undeclared war. It's more like a civil war. It's not really declared. It's a formal war in 1776 when America says that we're an independent nation. Now they have to fight to win it. A couple of interesting things here. The colonies were not all 100% behind this war. About 1/3 of the colonists didn't want it. They stayed loyal to England. They were called loyalists or Tories. They support Britain. And many others, they didn't want to fight. They just stayed out of it. So you have really not a majority of people who want independence. It's really some of the very powerful in America want independence. But as far as the people, it's about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So America is not unified in this, but there's enough. And Britain is so far away, it's going to be very hard for them to sustain this war. This is not where you have modern ships that can cross the ocean in a couple of weeks. You're talking this would take months for these soldiers to get deployed, to land, to get organized, and then go into battle. So logistically, or organizationally, this war is going to be very difficult for the British. The American Revolution, what are the strengths? The Americans have one strength, is that they are fighting on their home ground. They know the land. The weakness is they have a small army, not a lot of ammunition, not a lot of support, and not a lot of structure. These are not regular soldiers. You can't rely on them. They don't have a regular army. And that's the first order of business that Congress does, is they make a continental army of regular troops who will be there all the time. The British are organized. They have a strong army, but they're so far away. And they also have to keep things at home because France is always a threat to England. In the middle of the war, France sides with the colonies. That's a huge, huge asset for the American Revolution. And eventually, a war of attrition takes place. The British just can't sustain the war. They can't win an overwhelming victory because Washington refuses to fight big battles. His whole idea is keep the army around. If you keep a large armed force that can move, the British can't win the war. So he doesn't engage his army in big battles unless he knows he has a really good chance of winning. He fights small battles like skirmishes, and there the colonials can use tactics of defense and hiding in the woods, and they fight a war That is not the kind of war the English want to fight. Washington loses a lot of the battles, but he never loses so badly that the army is wiped out, and he wins key battles when he needs to win. He also is inspirational, and he is a great organizer. We talk about great military leaders a few times, and we talked about Cromwell, and why was he great? Was that he organized the model army. That's what Washington does. He takes a group of people who've never fought, and he makes them into an army, and they gain confidence. Even when they lose, they don't lose badly, and they get more experience. And when they win, and then they start winning, and they win again, they win battles that are important, and they start getting more confidence in themselves. So Washington is a genius because he kept the army alive with no supplies. It was quite an amazing feat. This is a picture of a huge battle. We're just hitting the highlights of the notes. This is the Battle of Saratoga, where the Allies win a big battle. Now, Washington did not fight this battle. Ironically, a man who will become a traitor, Benedict Arnold, is a huge factor in this battle and winning the battle. He gets injured, but he plays a huge role in it. And the British army surrenders. This is one of the British armies, and they surrender. And this makes France realize the United States can win this. The colonies can win this. And they throw their support and they ally with the Americas. And that is a huge asset because now their navy is going to come and their soldiers. So this is a huge battle. The war eventually ends at a battle called Yorktown. And there the British armies, basically, they had been advancing from South Carolina through North Carolina and into Virginia. And Washington and his armies, or whoever was commanding them, they just kept retreating and giving up the ground and trying to lure the British further and further away from their supplies, which were all the way in South Carolina and Charleston. Eventually, the British found themselves in a bad spot. Their army was tired and out of supplies, and so they wanted to resupply in Yorktown, which had a nice port. And that's when Washington struck. He surrounded their army, and the French fleet came, bottled up the harbor, and the British army had no supplies, no chance to resupply or get new troops. And the last British army surrenders, and the Revolutionary War is effectively over in 1781. Let's go look at some of the things from the textbook, and we can just review some of these. So key dates. In April 1775, hostilities begin at the battles of Lexington and Concord, and then later on at Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. Soon after this, Congress sets up a continental army, even though we're not a nation, and George Washington is put in command and organizing the army. In 1776, things start moving fast, and we see our friend here, John Locke. His ideas are adopted by Thomas Jefferson, and he is the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. The concept that the Declaration of Independence shows is popular sovereignty, and popular sovereignty is the idea of limited government based on separation of powers with checks and balances, but also that power comes from the people. So there's a large element of democracy in popular sovereignty. We're going to keep going. The revolution itself, this is going to be a little bit of a longer task. The British weaknesses in military, we talked about this, that the advantages that they had, they're fighting on their home ground, and again, they have a long way to go. And the leadership of Washington cannot be understated. This man he doesn't win every battle, but he does a really good job in motivating the army and leading the army and into victory. Saratoga, we mentioned, we showed a picture of it. This is huge because it leads to the alliance with France. It's a major victory for the Americans, and the French say, hey, our enemy is the British, and these guys can win. We're going to join them. Hard times happen, but Saratoga is kind of it's a turning point. The war starts to shift, that the Americans don't have a chance, and now it's like, we can win this thing. We talked about the Battle of Yorktown. The war ends with the treaty signed in Paris. It takes 2 years for this to happen. And basically what happens is Britain recognizes the independence of the United States, and the United States now has a new border all the way to the Mississippi River. So all this land that we talked about, which was disputed, I mean, we're not just talking about land at the Ohio River. We're talking about if the map could go on, this map is going to go on way over to here. If you look at your slide, way back at the beginning, here's what the colonies are. At the end of the war, it's all the way to here. It's all the way up to the Mississippi River. Here's the Mississippi and here's the Ohio River. And the United States is now a much larger country than Britain is. It's not settled, but it's their territory. So we're going to stop here. Tomorrow we'll be looking at the U.S. Constitution. That will be our last presentation on video. I know this one was a bit longer, but thank you. And you need to fill in your notes, and they need to be submitted tomorrow. So have a great day.